So Kennett Square was a small little town in southern Chester County, and it was primarily a retail center for the community that was emerging around it. And remember, Kennett Square today is still the mushroom capital of the world. So the most prominent industry sector that was in southern Chester County was the mushroom industry and the horticultural industry. So in those days, there were retail stores, there was a grocery store, and a lot of bars. and it was a little bit of a cowboy town. On a Friday night, Saturday night, there were incidents that you would read about and hear about where people were celebrating a little bit more robustly than maybe they should. But Kennett overall was not the Kennett Square it is today. And there was a major department store that was in Kennett Square that closed. The storyline was that there was a lot of vacancies that were starting to occur. But it was an interesting little town, small town. It was not a town you would really want to, it wasn't a destination town. It was a town of necessity. And that's how it kind of was created. And what has happened in Kennett Square, like a lot of small towns, there were malls that were being developed outside of these little small towns and hamlets. And because of that shopping center experiences, it was when residential developments were occurring more in the environs around Kennett, it was easier for people to go to those particular shopping centers instead of going into town. And what happened, there were some vacancies. People started to move out their businesses. The retail started to move out. As I mentioned, there was a prominent department store that closed, and there were some vacancies. I got a call and got introduced to Michael Walker through an attorney. His name was Peter Temple. And Peter Temple was a very four-bus guy that was very involved in the community and met Mr. Walker as he was starting to start his business. And the reason that Michael Walker came to Kennett Square was because Michael Walker's wife, Mrs. Walker, was a resident of the town. And there was a nice urban center where there was some upscale housing of some of the executive officers who had businesses in the environs lived there in the Kennett near the country club. And that was right outside of town. And Mrs. Walker saw what was happening to her hometown and said, Michael, if you're going to start these businesses, there's a lot of vacancy within the middle of Kennett Square. So when Peter Temple introduced us together, he said, Gary, can you come down and meet this gentleman? And I did. And I met Michael Walker at that time. And we had a state representative who was very prominent. His name was Joe Pitts. And Joe Pitts was a Kennett Square native who was a school teacher, ran for state office, was a state representative, and loved the town as well. And he was introduced. Peter Temple brought us all in the room and said, this gentleman wants to start a business that could be very, very large. So Michael Walker and his partners at the time came and we met and we sat down, and they were starting this Genesis Health Ventures. And Genesis Health Ventures was supplying support services for nursing cares and for elderly care residents that were a growing need in our society because of the demographic changes. And the national headquarters was going to be here in Kennett Square. So Peter Temple and a couple other investors bought this old shelf and furniture store building. They retrofitted it, and Michael Walker launched his business in that particular building and grew that very substantially to a point where he outgrew it. It was a 3-story building, and he outgrew that building. But he was so passionate for Kennett, he said, it's easier for me now, if I wanted to, is to move out, get into one of these, new industrial parks that was emerging outside of Kennett Square. But that's not going to help Kennett. He had a love and a passion because his wife had a love and a passion for the town, and said, let's try to do something where we can basically put your national headquarters in the middle of the town. And when you do that, you'll bring people back to the town, and there'll be places to eat and get their haircuts and nails and fixed and all these different things that we need to have. And there'll be law firms will be there and restaurants will come to support that. And Michael Walker and I, we had a small working committee, and every week we would have a meeting to try to help move that forward. So what he had to do is go and acquire properties. So we bought a vacant building and another one and then another one, and a couple that weren't for sale, he made offers for them to sell. So eventually we accumulated almost a half a block of real estate in the middle of Kennett Square. And this took years to do. Well, it was at least 3 years in making. We had a water tower that was right in the middle of town that we had to move a water tower. Okay, that was the municipal water supply. So we did that as well. And it took some grants, it took some loans. So I was instrumental in trying to help coordinate all that with all the things that we do as an organization here. And furthermore, there had to be a parking garage because parking is always a problem. You're growing the town. You had to place people to park. If you want people to shop, they have to feel safe where they can park their vehicle. There has to be some structured parking created there because there were going to be a lot of new employees that were going to occupy. So Michael built this building. Art Bernardin, who was a very prominent, today he's a very nationally prominent architect, but he was also a Kennett Square native, grew up in Kennett. His father was in the mushroom industry. Art went to become an architect and his further education and created a very successful architectural firm that grew as well. And Art came in and designed this building known as their national headquarters there in Kennett Square. So at that point in time, it was a beautiful, stately building that left, Michael Walker's prints over it. The building's named after him today. And the rest of the story, as they say. He also expanded. They built another building in Kennett Square that we worked with. So Genesis really was so instrumental with the transformation of the character of what Kennett. Kennett became now sort of a community where you had people that worked there every day. That populated the streets. It wasn't just the Friday night party town. It became more or less a really substantial community that brought banks in, that brought other support systems in, brought different merchants in, specialty stores who had higher income, clientele for some of the decors that people wanted in their homes and the like. So it sort of changed the whole complexion of the community. But the community still has, to its core, has its heritage as far as centered around mushrooms and that industry and that support for the town. There's really a takeaway. It was more or less a love story. It really was between what Michael Walker and his wife did. And as they started that business and grew that business, he went to his shareholders and stockholders and said, listen, this is going to cost us more money, but this is the right thing to do for the right reasons. Because it would have been a lot easier to go out of town, take a green site and build a building instead of retrofitting and taking all the public infrastructure that the company invested in that town to make it the town it is today. And they just didn't do it cheaply. They did it with taste and flair. And as I say, these are really architectural beauties. And now it's going through a transformation, but the structures will still be there. And the integrity of the property and what the commitment that Michael Walker made to the town, I think, still exists. And what we want to do here as an organization is making sure that the new investors and people who are coming in to retrofit these properties, just like Michael Walker did in his time, everything has a time and a place. And now we want these new people to still embrace that culture and care of taking care of these assets that we've been entrusted with as stewards of God's earth. Michael Walker was such an entrepreneurial visionary for his company, for the town, for the community. A very philanthropic gentleman. Yes, he left his fingerprints all over Kennett Square. So much so, not only in our community, but in other communities around the country that his companies have been involved with. They also, because of his commitment for doing what's right for the right reasons, we recognize him into our Chester County Hall of Fame. So he's also a Chester County Hall of Fame awardee. And we're honored to recognize Michael Walker and his legacy that has been left here in Chester County, and to he and his family that really were highly committed, and that were really pioneers. And wasn't many people in at that time were coming back into our small towns. They were sort of a period of time when people wanted to get out of those towns, but he really had that true commitment. And as they say, it's kind of a love story because of his commitment to his wife and her passion for seeing what Kennett was when she was a young young lady and seeing what it was becoming, she said, we have to do something about this, and we have to make sure that the future generations can value and treasure our small towns that we have in Chester County, in our boroughs, and our city of Coatesville. We need more people like Michael Walker in this county to come back and reinvest within some of our historic legacy towns within Chester County.